An interest in learning philosophy is often met by immediate frustration. If you just dive into one of the major works, Kant, Descartes, you'll quickly be rebuffed that the language is confusing, archaic, it's technical, it's difficult to read. Philosophy is unlike any other skill that you've probably been exposed to in the course of your life, and it's nothing like reading, even if the primary activity is, well, reading. Today I want to discuss a step-by-step sequence of books that you can read to take you from beginner to less beginner, let's say. Though I will say I'm only an amateur myself, and these are just the books and tools that I found useful in getting into reading philosophy. Links to all of the books that I'm talking about today are in the description below, including, where available, free translations that you can read immediately. I also owe a debt of gratitude to Susan Rigetti, whose excellent study guides for philosophy, maths and physics have used to great effect myself, and some of the suggestions of these books, but not all of them, came from her philosophy study guide. And if you're looking for a much more comprehensive but committed undergraduate level study of philosophy, then I highly recommend that you check out that guide, which I've also linked to. Now, if you're already here, you've probably got some idea about why you are interested in philosophy. But I thought I'd quickly elaborate on some of the reasons why philosophy is ideal even for the self-learner who has no intention of studying it at a degree level. Philosophy ultimately is a process of improving the clarity of our own thinking. It gives us the tools to understand, dissect, and analyse arguments separating good logic from bad logic, and can help improve the clarity and structure of our own writing and study, as well as help us to contemplate our own standards of morals and ethics and bring practical wisdom to our day-to-day life. One of the early frustrations to the philosophy beginner will be trying to figure out even what philosophy is trying to answer or what the subject entails. And the best that I can say is that it's a style of inquiry that tries to systematically answer questions in the most abstract sense of the word. But a definition like that gives you very little to go on. One of the problems with defining philosophy is how broad its inquiry is. So it might be useful to go through some of the major branches of philosophy and explain the sort of things they tackle, and then you'll get an idea, if not a strict definition, of what philosophy is. So you've got epistemology, which is a question to what is knowledge and how do we come to understand knowledge. You can study ethics, which is, good, evil, right, wrong. Logic, the study of reasoning and argument. Metaphysics, which is a little harder to get your head around, but it's the study of reality. What is the nature of time and space and matter and objects. And a major, more modern branch of philosophy is the philosophy of the mind, so consciousness and how do we know that we're thinking and what is thought and what is free will. But the first hurdle for the budding philosopher is not to try and answer any of these questions. Your first hurdle is actually to improve your reading and analytical ability so that you're able to engage with these texts effectively. As I said, most philosophical texts are technical, jargon-laden, archaic, and often very difficult in language, especially if they've been written hundreds of years ago. And if we lack knowledge of the context that philosophy takes place in, the history through time of it, then we lose much of what is valuable about the work. So hopefully this sequence of books is going to give you a pathway that is going to develop that reading ability. It's going to teach you some of the analytical tools that philosophers use, and it's going to give you that context to be able to engage with philosophy while understanding the wider range of work that it's responding to. But reading philosophy, which is the main way that we study philosophy, is not the same as reading any other book. In the first instance, philosophy needs to be read at least twice. You should read the work once, quickly, without notes, so that you understand the broad strokes of the argument, and then you should go back at least once more for a more detailed analysis of the work. It's this second read-through where we have to read in a very active and engaged way. We have to be asking questions of the author, we have to be responding to their points, we have to be trying to find counterexamples or deciding if we agree or disagree. And it's not unusual for major texts to require months of engagement to study them. And as a beginner, it's going to be hard to do this for more than 30 minutes to an hour at a time. If you approach philosophy like you approach a novel, you're likely to walk away from the book not really understanding what you've read. And a great first book to start this learning plan is A Little History of Philosophy by Nigel Warburton. Now, this isn't a book that you're going to need to study or read more than once. It's a fun, charming illustrated guide to the philosophy from the Greeks all the way to the modern day. It just touches base very briefly with their major ideas and themes. It's no way academically rigorous, nor is it a substitute for more study of those ideas, but it is a very light commitment to getting a sense of if this topic is for you. And we're going to build a little bit of that vital context that I was talking about. This learning plan doesn't recommend any further histories to read, but at some point it is very valuable to read a further history of philosophy. And there's a lot of histories of philosophy out there. I can personally recommend both The Story of Philosophy by Will Durant and also A History of Western Philosophy by Bertrand Russell. Some other well-regarded histories are A New History of Western Philosophy by Anthony Kenny, and you've also got The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, which I've read some of the volumes in that, but not all of them, though that last one, A History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, is available as a podcast, which it originally started as, which is a great way to engage with a history of philosophy without having to read, while you're walking or doing your shops or whatever. Okay, so with a little bit of that context in place and an idea of what philosophy is about, we're going to move on to Think by Simon Blackburn, and this book is recommended all the time for philosophy, and it's on many, many philosophy programs, and it's for good reason. Blackburn is a very clear and lucid writer, very easy to digest book, and it's going to go through all of the major ideas and questions in philosophy, touching on loads and loads and loads of different thinkers and what they thought about it. This book is going to serve to answer two really important questions about the study of philosophy. The first one being, what are the major themes of philosophy? And then the second one, and most important I think, is why is philosophy relevant and why is it relevant to you and normal people? This very broad strokes overview is going to connect very well with the history and give you an idea of how these thinkers interrelate with one another. So far, we've been reading works about philosophy, though they're not written in a particularly philosophical style. So it's time to introduce a work that's going to let us experience what it's like to read a philosopher. So for this I'm going to recommend The Problems of Philosophy by Bertrand Russell, another introductory classic. Of all of the writers of philosophy, I think Bertrand Russell is the easiest to read while maintaining the sort of style that philosophers use. The Problems of Philosophy aims to be a short introduction to the main ideas that philosophy tries to answer, though it ends up mainly focusing on a particular theory of knowledge that Bertrand Russell helped develop. However, even though it only touches on this one field of knowledge, it gives an opportunity to touch base with many of the major thinkers of philosophy. Russell's style in this book will be the most analytical style that you've yet encountered, and will require you to slow down and more carefully read the sentences to understand what is being said. This is a skill that we'll have to develop over time, and this will be your first introduction to that style of reading. I recommend that you stay reading The Problems of Philosophy until you really understand the content, and that will serve as a really great base for closer reading of the rest of the text in this list. So next I want to introduce a work that's been written by a contemporary philosopher, Intuition Pumps and Other Tools for Thinking by Daniel Dennett. Unfortunately, Dennett passed away last year, but his writing is some of the most clear and easy to read for the non-technical philosopher. And though he has many technical works, he wrote many very, very good books for the mass market. Intuition Pumps and Other Tools for Thinking serves as a broad overview of much of the work he did in his life, but it's going to teach us three main things. The first is how to use thought experiments, or what Dennett refers to as an intuition pump. And thought experiments are one of the primary tools that philosophers use to develop understanding and to gain insight. These are experiments in the mind that help identify problems or flaws or interesting things about what are otherwise very abstract topics. And Dennett was a real master of using thought experiments and analysing thought experiments. So his teachings in these books are a really great introduction to how to consider thought experiments in the works that you read. The second one is that he gives great advice on how to do a close reading of a text and how to identify when a author is trying to pull the wool over your eyes or hide a weak point in the argument. Now, Dennett is famous for being quite a combative philosopher, and philosophy sometimes at its best is when they start tearing clumps out of each other in the sort of passive-aggressive but polite way of academics. That sort of criticism aside, and one of the criticisms of this book is that he does go out on the attack of some of his contemporaries. This ability to closely read a text is something that you're going to have to develop, and being able to identify where a work is weak is a very important skill. And finally, the overview of his work and his use of thought experiments in some of his work is a great introduction to one of the philosophies of mind. Dennett was a proponent of a Darwinian theory of mind, which I'll let the text define better than I could. The theory of the mind is always one of the most exciting and mind-blowing areas of philosophy. So as a beginner just getting into it, it's probably one of the easiest branches that will make you go, holy wow, it's a radical shift in perception even if you don't agree with Dennett's work. You're going to be keen at this point to read some actual philosophy and put the tools and the reading to use. And I'm going to recommend a book that I've recommended before, but there's a good reason for that, and that's the Discourses by Epictetus. And I keep a copy of this in my rucksack and I take it everywhere I go. Your first primary text needs to be easy to engage with. The first time you read a primary philosophical text is going to take a really long time. It's going to be difficult. You're going to want to put it down all the time. You're going to go weeks without reading it. And the Discourses is a great introduction to that because it's a Stoic text. I have another video about Stoicism, but the Stoics were very interested in practical philosophy that you could use in your day-to-day life, which means that their philosophy tends to be less abstract. It's more concrete, which helps the beginner to understand it and to use it. The Discourses is inherently separated into small chunks, which helps us engage with our reading. And I recommend that you read this by reading a discourse and then answering 3 questions about that discourse. So the first question will be, what is the discourse about? What is Epictetus trying to tell us? The second question is, do I agree with this? And the third question is, to what extent do I or do I not practice what I am being told in this discourse? By answering those 3 questions for every discourse, you're going to have a very thorough engagement with the work. This is a really good opportunity to practice all of the things that we've been learning and really develop your skill as a student of philosophy. So my final suggestion for this introductory learning plan is that you read this, Essays and Aphorisms by Schopenhauer. Now this is going to be a big step up in difficulty. I would put Schopenhauer, in terms of the difficulty of reading, somewhere in the middle between the easiest and the hardest philosophers to read, but it's still going to be very unfamiliar to the beginner. The advantage of Essays and Aphorisms over his other work is that this aphoristic style, these short ideas and segments, not only is a very popular style in philosophy, but it means that it gives us a chance to take a breather, to analyse what we've just read and ensure that we're engaging in it. It gives us a chance to walk away from the work when we get exhausted from our study. I've got the Penguin Classics translation, which includes an introductory essay which tells you everything you need to know about his general philosophy so that you can understand some of the words that he uses in this book and how they're used. That's an important skill for philosophy students to understand as well. Often philosophers will redefine words in common usage with a more specific technical definition, and it takes a bit of getting used to be able to read a work and supplant one meaning for a word with the meaning that's being used now. This collection of essays is also going to give you a wonderful opportunity to practice disagreeing with a text. On Woman is a famous Schopenhauer essay, which is a indefensible and sexist attack on women. It seems silly to suggest that disagreeing with a text is a skill in itself, but I think the normal mode of reading is that we're going to agree with what we've read. We've bought the book, so we set out with the assumption that we're going to agree with it. And when we read philosophy, we have to enter with a different assumption, which is actually no assumption. It's a neutral stance. So it's fit for purpose that this collection of essays includes one that is so easy to disagree with. I hope that this introduction to philosophy and suggestions on how to engage with it as a learner has been insightful and useful for you. And I'd be really interested to hear from you in the comments which philosophy you're reading, what you're excited about reading, other works that you thought were good for your journey. And I'd really like to know who your favourite philosophers are. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this. My name is Harry Smith, and this is Pages to Practice.